This is Magnus Carlsen, one of the greatest chess players of all time. And while he's been able to dominate his human opponents, what happens when he goes up against a cheater who is using a computer engine? While most cheaters completely annihilate their opponent, this is Magnus we're talking about. The guy almost never loses, except of course against me. He faced the strongest 2100 of all time when he was playing on Banter Blitz on Chess24, the inferior website, usechess.com. Let's look at the game. So let's get into the game. I'm putting Stockfish's suggestions up here so that you can see how closely the cheater played. Magnus started off with the red T opening, and his opponent played the Dutch. The Dutch is usually not played at high levels because it creates a kingside weakness. Magnus continued with D3, and here his opponent played knight f6. As you can see, that's the top computer move. The most common human move actually is playing d6. Magnus continued with e4, and his opponent took on e4. Again, the computer loves that, but for humans, taking has a bad reputation because even though you give black an extra pawn, white gets a huge advance in development and usually a nice attack. The most common move is knight f6 here, and I could see that the computer was not deciding between knight f6 and d5. The reason why knight f6 is scary is after knight g5, white is putting pressure on h7 and looking towards the f7 square that is weak. It is a very tricky line, so I'm guessing the computer just decided that d5 was better. d5, and here Magnus instantly trades off pieces. Even though he's down a pawn, his opponent has two isolated doubled pawns. Magnus is going to win the pawn back on e4. He plays knight g5, attacking the pawn on e4, but also looking towards f7 to fork the king and the rook. So black has to defend on f7, and what Magnus did very well here is that he was in no rush to recapture on e4. He could do this at any time, so he decided to first focus on developing his pieces. He played knight c3, now attacking the pawn twice. White plays bishop f4, putting one defender and starting to develop his bishop. Magnus continued developing his pieces in the same way, and here we'll see some development from both sides. Magnus was able to castle, the cheater played e5. This is a strong move because it's putting the pawn towards the center and it's also freeing up the bishop to look towards b4. If he's somehow able to take on c3, he'd double Magnus's pawns and make it harder for him to recapture on e4. Magnus plays bishop e3. It's a better square than going to g3 because on g3 you're blocked and you don't have as much potential moves. His opponent first played bishop e7. What he was doing here is putting pressure on the knight on g5 because if he would be able to trade, he would take away one attacker from the pawn on e4. So Magnus finally decided to take the pawn. This is a good position for white because the knight on e4 cannot get kicked out by any pawn. So this is called a knight outpost, and knights are usually the best piece to block an isolated pawn or a pass pawn. His opponent continued with rook d8, offering a trade, bringing his rook to a better position and grabbing the open file. Magnus wasn't bothered by it because he can always recapture, so he played f3 to help put an extra defender on e4. Knight d4, and here black is putting his knight on a good square as well because it's defended by his own pawn, and Magnus wouldn't want to take because then this pawn would no longer be isolated. So instead, he activates one of his pieces, he puts it on the semi-open file, and he starts looking towards e5. Black plays king f7. He's not able to castle because his king already moved, and he has to get his rook into play somehow, but his king was on the square where his rook wants to go. Here, Magnus plays rook d2, preparing to double up his rooks. His opponent plays h6 just to control the square on g5 and not worry about any tactics there. Of course, I'm guessing what the computer was thinking. This is how I would explain it. And here Magnus starts maneuvering his pieces. He knows that the main weakness in black's position is this e5 pawn, but his minor pieces right now are blocking the way. How can he put more pressure? He plays knight f2 with the idea of coming towards d3 and looking towards the pawn on e5. Black finds a really tricky move here, bishop b4. And the reason why this is good is because it's pinning the knight and holding it from going to the e4 square if his other knight goes to d3. keeping in mind that e4 is the best square for the knight in this position. Magnus continues with knight d3, and everything starts getting traded off here. We get to this endgame, which is looking very equal. I gotta say, this 2100 is sure holding his own as the black pieces against Magnus Carlsen. Black accomplished something major here. He was able to get rid of the knights so that Magnus would not be able to go back to the e4 square. It does feel like an equal endgame, which is an incredible result for a 2100 with the black pieces against Magnus, right? He continued with a5, probably to stop b4 or b5. Magnus continued with rook b3, attacking the b7 pawn. Black defends, and here he pushes a4. They start activating their kings, as you always should in the endgame. g5 is kind of a weird move, and the reason for that is it's moving the base of the pawn chain from g7 to h6. And now the bishop is looking towards it, and in the future he can have some ideas like h4. Keep in mind that the shorter the amount of time Magnus's opponent had on the clock, the less depth he could run his engine, so I think it was causing it to be slightly weaker, but of course that doesn't take away from how well Magnus was playing this game. Magnus continued with king e2, bringing his king more towards the center, b6 so that his rook would be free from defending the b7 square, rook c3, putting pressure on the knight and the pawn on c7, forcing the king to come to his defense. Here Magnus also played b3, connecting his pawns, also looking towards the c4 square. And I'll move a little bit more quickly here because I want to get to the very interesting position. Here, Magnus played c3. This move shows Magnus's deep understanding of endgames and how to play the bishop versus the knight. If his opponent would have taken the sack on b3, what we notice about this bishop is that it's looking towards both sides of the board. On the queen side, Black cannot make a pass pawn, b5 doesn't work, and also if he would ever push, the pawn on c5 would be very weak. Magnus would continue here with h4. His bishop is looking towards both of these two pawns, and even if Black were to defend it, he would end up at least creating an isolated pawn for Black. And I know a lot of people are looking at the computer evaluation, but positions with plus 0.13 are Magnus's bread and butter. He knows how to somehow turn these into a win. Instead, his opponent played knight to f5. He's looking towards the bishop on e3, and you might be thinking, this looks like a closed position, all of the pawns are on the dark squares, wouldn't I be happy by trading off the bishops? No. He plays bishop f2, and it's going to be that similar idea with if knight had taken on b3, where this bishop, if it gets back to e3 later, is very powerful looking towards both flanks. Computer continued with knight d6. I'm going to call him the computer now, not the cheater. And Magnus played rook g4. He's already starting to look towards the g5 pawn because the king side is where he has the best chance of creating a pass pawn or an isolated pawn for Black. Black doesn't have a ton of moves. Again, he can't push on the queen side, so he just starts repositioning his king. Magnus continues with h4, and Black plays rook d8 here, trying to create some kind of discovery check. So, Magnus just moves his king. The engine is already starting to give Magnus a clear advantage here, which means he was outplaying him. And here, Magnus won on the clock, but he was already starting to get an edge against the cheater computer. I'm going to show you how this game could have played out and why Magnus is better, and then I'll let you know what the accuracy of the game was. Let's say that Black would have continued with a move like knight f7 to defend the pawn on g5. Magnus would have put his bishop back on e3 to put pressure on g5. Let's say Black defends it. He could trade off the pawns and then look back towards the queen side of the board with ideas like b4, trying to trade off the pawns, and then after rook takes b4, he's going to win the pawn on b6. Of course, Black would have played more accurately, but the takeaway here is that the bishop is faster at looking towards both sides of the board, while the knight takes a longer time to get from one side to the other. So this is the kind of advantage Magnus would have tried playing with, on top of the fact that he had created an isolated pawn, so now he would have tried to create a second weakness, so it's harder to defend both. Now let's get to the fun part, the accuracy. Magnus's accuracy was 97.7, and the cheater's accuracy, 97.1. How crazy is that? Thank you so much for watching, and also a huge shout out to the YouTube channel Classical. He helped work with me on this video, so you should check out his channel.